This morning, as we look at this passage, John chapter 6, I want us to think about a few things that Jesus is saying. A long time ago, I was sitting in a class and someone said, which sounded to me at the time to be very astute, they said, well, Jesus is not talking about the Lord's Supper here because he has not instituted the Lord's Supper. I thought, that's insightful. Later on, I realized, no, it's not whether Jesus in John 6 is talking about the Lord's Supper. It's about whether communion, the Lord's Supper, is talking about Jesus and what he taught. And once I realized, well, of course they're related. No, Jesus isn't giving a lesson to the people there about the meaning of the Lord's Supper. He's teaching what he's teaching, and later, at the Last Supper, as he's celebrating the Passover with his disciples, he reimagines it in a new way. He takes the two most common things off that table, not the lamb, not the bitter herbs, not other things with the cedar. He takes just the bread and just the cup, and he reimagines the whole Exodus experience, and he's basically proclaiming, we're on the verge of a new Exodus, and I'm the lamb under whose care you are delivered from slavery. And so, of course, when he does that, it is reminiscent of everything he's been talking about, how he said, I am the light of the world, and I am the living water, and I am the resurrection and the life, and I am the bread, and all of it. So today, when we're reading John chapter 6 and this whole discussion that goes on in this passage, we need to be thinking about, yes, it is speaking to us about Eucharist or communion or the Lord's Supper, whatever term you want to use. It's what Jesus taught and what he lived, and then which that all gets embodied in the practice of Holy Communion, right? So that when we participate in this, we are recalling his life, his teachings, who he is, what he said about himself. So now I definitely read this as having to do with communion. And I want us to read it that way this morning. And I want the emphasis, part of what I want to talk about is, I kind of grew up with the idea that we needed to take Holy Communion, we need to take communion right. But I think there's a more important way, which is to take it well. In other words, kind of the idea was we wanted to make sure we had the right things on the table and we did it in the right way. There's nothing wrong with wanting to do it right, but that's kind of a low bar. And taking it well means the kind of way we think about it and how we engage in it. That somehow, to me, I think is more important than whether we get certain parts of it correctly. So this morning, as we look at what Jesus is saying here, I want us to think about it and maybe urge us in the direction of taking it well, which there's always room to take it better than I have in the past, right? It's a thing into which I can grow more and more. How is it that I engage these Christian practices? So in the passage, our passage this morning is really 41 through 51, but it includes 35, which was part of last week's reading, because it wants, the reading wants to take up again what Jesus said about himself, and then the emphasis is upon how people were reacting to it. So in 35, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life, he who comes to me will no longer hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. So I am the bread of life. Then in 41, we start with the part of how people were reacting to what he's saying. Therefore, the Jews were grumbling about him because he said, I am the bread which comes down out of heaven. Now, there's something interesting here that's very intentional on John's part, is the choice of the word grumbling. Remember last week when we were reading from Exodus 16 about the story of the children of Israel have come out of Egypt and now they're in the wilderness and they don't have food, or at least not as readily as they want it. And they're saying, did God just bring us out of Egypt so that we would starve here in the wilderness? And it says they grumbled. It's the exact same word. I know that was originally written in Hebrew. It was later translated by the rabbis 200 years before Jesus into Greek. And the word that the rabbis use to translate Exodus 16 into Greek is the same word John uses here, grumbling. Now that's intentional. John wants us to think, okay, you remember in the wilderness, Israel grumbled and God gave them manna. And here Jesus is saying, I'm the bread of life, and Israel is grumbling, right? John's saying we're revisiting a very similar incident. But what are they grumbling about? Why are they dissatisfied? So it says the Jews grumbled about him because he said, I am the bread which came down out of heaven. They were saying, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down out of heaven? And my first thought was, okay, so they don't understand Jesus because they're thinking too literally. They're thinking like he's claiming like I descended somehow, on a cloud, in a fiery chariot or something, came down out of heaven. They're saying, wait a minute. No, this guy was born right here. We know his parents. He didn't magically come down out of heaven. And then I realized, no, they weren't taking it literally. That's how I tend to take it. I don't think those people who heard Jesus saying, I am the bread which has come down out of heaven, were thinking, well, he can't be because we know he was born here. They knew he was talking figuratively. It's not that they thought he was saying something absurd and that his appearance on earth had been somehow supernatural and they were disputing it because they knew his parents. It's because they knew what he was saying and they did have a problem with it, but not because they thought literally. That's my problem. I tend to read it literally. So what did they think he was saying? And why do then they bring up his parents? Well, if we keep reading, verse 43, Jesus answered and said to them, do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught of God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. It seems that in what Jesus says in response to their grumbling gives us a real clue as to what he meant by saying, I'm the bread, and what they understood when he said, I'm the bread. And that's this idea of, but the prophets have said they will all be taught of God. What Jesus is saying is, the prophets have said people need to know the ways of God, and I am the bread which has come down from heaven to teach you these ways of God, to share with you the message of God. And he's saying that metaphorically as if I'm bread. I'm what you need to eat. I'm what you need to take in because I'm the one who can tell you the ways of God. And I think they understood what he was saying, that this is about whether or not he is the one who has come to show them and has insight into who God is and to show them the way of God and to teach them the way of God, to be the bread, their spiritual bread for their sustenance. And see, their grumbling is not that you seem to be claiming something strange that we know didn't happen. And the reason they bring up his parents is the same reason they've always brought up his family. Because he doesn't come from the kind of family that you would expect such a Messiah to come from. Earlier in this gospel, Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Right? The skepticism. He grew up in Nazareth. We know Joseph and Mary. Look, this is not a prophetic family, right? These are ordinary common people. How can he say he's this extraordinary one who uniquely can show us the ways of God and can speak of himself as the bread we need? How can he say that? See, there's a tradition, there's a precedent in Jewish thinking relating the message of God to bread. And I thought about this when I was thinking about this passage. I remember Jesus in the temptation in the wilderness. And the devil says, why don't you turn these stones into bread? And Jesus quotes the Old Testament and says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word which comes from the mouth of God. See, there already is the relationship between bread and what you get from God. in terms of teaching, in terms of message. That comes from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. Here's the whole passage where Moses is talking to Israel about their previous experience of wandering in the desert and getting manna and what all of that meant. Moses says, as he's trying to interpret the experience, he says of God, he humbled you and let you go hungry and fed you with the manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, in order to make you understand that man shall not live on bread alone, but man shall live on everything that comes out of the mouth of the Lord. See, there's this really old relationship between bread and what it is you really need to live on, and that being not bread, Moses says, but what God says. So when Jesus says, I'm the bread that's come down out of heaven, and explicitly talks about Moses and manna and their fathers long ago eating manna and yet dying, but he is the bread that gives life, they're not confused about what he's saying. They're grumbling because they don't believe he's that one. Who are you to claim you can show us the Father that nobody's seen, but you say you know him and you've seen him unlike everyone else? That's where they find it hard to believe what he's saying. So in essence, Jesus is saying, as great as the whole Exodus saga is in your Jewish thinking, and it was the high point. Exodus, that's how we came out of slavery and out of Egypt. That's when God saved us and brought us to Sinai and made us his people and gave us the law and made us, his unique chosen people. In Jewish thinking, they look back to that time, the cloud and the pillar and the plagues and all these demonstrations, and they said that was the incredible age in which God was leading us. Now it's long past, but boy, that was amazing. And Jesus is basically saying, I am greater than all of that Exodus event, right? I'm greater. I'm bringing about something even more significant than what you esteem to be like the high point of your tradition as a people. That's where they grumbled, right? That's why they had problems with Jesus. Okay, that's, I think, what's going on. It ends with verse 51. And I am the living bread that came down out of heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread also, I like the word also, which I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. I think the also indicates that he's saying there's two things going on here. There's what I've come to teach you, but also I'm going to give my physical body for the life of the world. In one sense, I'm the bread because I am the master teacher who can reveal to you the true nature of my Father that you've misunderstood, maybe partially understood, but I can tell you who my Father is in a way that you've not grasped. But also, I'm going to give my life for the world. And I'm bread also in that way. So how do we think about it? So I thought of 4 different things, and I know time is fleeting, so I'll keep them quick, or I'll try. Let's see how well I can do. So I read this passage, like I said, in terms of our practice of communion, because that practice that we engage in on a regular basis is instilling in us, and we are enacting in a very physical manner what is essentially the teachings of Jesus put into a practice. That's how I view it. And that we are, we're engaged in what Jesus talked about, because it wasn't just things to hold in your head, it was things to put into practice in life. And it's all kind of signified in this regular meal of fellowship that's got so many layers of meaning that we're not going to talk about all of them, but let me touch on a few. So number one, we realize that Holy Communion is not a duty to perform simply because we were told to. It's much richer than that. Sometimes it's easy to think, well, Jesus said, remember me and take this, and so I need to do it. That's not a terrible motivation, but it's so far short of understanding. It's not just I was told to do something and I do it. It's that I'm participating in something that is so full and meaningful in terms of who Jesus is and what he talked about. That's what I'm leaning into. That's what I'm participating in. Not just fulfilling a duty, as it were, checking a box, but it's an embodied practice of truth, the truth of who Jesus is. And I proclaim that when I participate. I am in my way proclaiming, yes, I understand you to be that which keeps me alive. And so I participate in a way of symbolizing that with eating, physical food, which I know I need to eat or I won't stay alive. But I'm seeing you as within this food. I'm proclaiming you to be the same type of food that keeps me alive spiritually as I need to be kept alive physically. And so all of that's wrapped up. It's a proclamation. It's a confession of our faith, of who we believe Jesus to be. So somehow we're participating in all of this. And Jesus says to remember him, but that's not because communion becomes an antidote to forgetfulness. It's the antidote to sin and death. He doesn't say remember me because we're prone to forget, and we are prone to forget. But this is not the antidote to being forgetful. This is our understanding and re-engaging in the belief and the perspective that the antidote to what really is killing me spiritually, that which it brings me death, is Jesus. I have a serious, chronic, and potentially fatal disease. It's my sin. But Jesus is the medicine for that. Like when we do communion and we use St. John Chrysostom's liturgy, or at least a modified version of it, from the 400s, he talks about that. This is the medicine of immortality, the antidote to death. He uses that language. It's like we're ill and we're coming and receiving and we're affirming Jesus is the only one in whom I can find life. And without him, it's death, right? It's putting that into an affirmation and into a ritualized practice for us. So there's a way that I now think that Jesus is both symbolized in this bread and cup that we receive, but there's a way in which I need to understand that he's also present. And that's what Derek was talking about to the kids. The understanding that we're not simply taking a morsel to eat and a cup to drink, and that this represents Jesus, but that also somehow he is present because he's present in absolutely everything. I dislike all ways of trying to describe how he's present. If we try and work out the mechanisms and the way that happens, I think that's foolish. It's a mystery. I don't know how Christ is present in my neighbor either, but I'm told when you do it to the least of these, you're doing it to me. Jesus is saying, I'm that neighbor you meet. I don't have to work out how that's possible. I have to live with the perspective that that's true. I think that's the point. St. John Chrysostom, again, prolific preacher and bishop of Constantinople, said in the 400s in one of his sermons, he said to the Christians coming to his church, if you can't find Jesus in the beggar at the church door, you won't find him in the chalice. See, they had such a belief that Christ is truly present in these elements, and he was he understood that belief, and he's saying, if you're not understanding that he's also present in the beggar who's sitting at the church door asking for alms, then you really don't understand what the cup is about. Because I thoroughly believe that part of what we are being taught in this practice is that Jesus is present everywhere and in everything and in everyone. And if he can be present in something as ordinary as a piece of bread, well, then why wouldn't I think he's present in sunrises and in my neighbor and in a baby and in everything, right? It's kind of a way of remembering Jesus is always present, and there is nowhere in which he is not, but in all things. See, it seems to me that either Jesus is everywhere or he's nowhere. And his proclamation is, I'm everywhere. And so we come to the table and we're reminded, yes, Jesus is everywhere. And when I leave, I need to have the perspective that he is present and coming to me in these things I receive, because they can also be spiritual food and not simply physical items and elements. He's present in everything, and so when I leave, I look at the world that way. He's present in everyone else, in everything that's happening, and how do I find him? I think that's the point. So we have bread and cup from the Passover meal, simple staples, but Jesus telling us, I'm those. I'm in those. And when you receive them, you receive me. So this morning, as we come together and come to the table, and I like the fact that we come to the table. Sometimes we'll do it differently, but I like coming to the table because there's something a little bit humbling about I need to go and receive, right? And I know I'm approaching the Lord who's then serving me his meal and saying, here, I'm your spiritual food. I'm your spiritual drink. As we come this morning, it's not about did we get the right bread and do we have the right liquid in the cup? It's not what it's about. It's not about he told us to do it and we better do it. It's so much richer than that. He's enticing us to a new and radical view of the world, the kingdom of God as he talked about it. That people said, where is it? And he said, it's in your midst. It's within you. God reigns everywhere, all around you, even within you. Come to my table and I'll serve you. Receive me and I will give you life. Eat my teachings. Drink in my teachings, my way of life. And I will raise you up in the last day. Amen.